Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoy this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 7. Gordon Spilett was standing motionless on the shore, his arms crossed, gazing over the sea, the horizon of which was lost towards the east in a thick black cloud which was spreading rapidly towards the zenith. The wind was already strong and increased with the decline of the day. The whole sky was of a threatening aspect, and the first symptoms of a violent storm were clearly visible. Herbert entered the chimneys, and Pencroft went towards the reporter. The latter, deeply absorbed, did not see him approach. "We're going to have a dirty night, Mr. Spilett," said the sailor. "Petrels delight in wind and rain." The reporter, turning at the moment, saw Pencroft, and his first words were, "At what distance from the coast would you say the car was when the waves carried off our companion?" The sailor had not expected this question. He reflected an instant and replied, "2 cables' length at the most." "But what is a cable's length?" asked Gideon Spilett. "About 120 fathoms, or 600 feet. "Then," said the reporter, "Cyrus Harding must have disappeared 1,200 feet at the most from the shore?" "About that," replied Pencroft. "And his dog also?" "Also." "What astonishes me," rejoined the reporter, while admitting that our companion has perished, is that Top has also met his death, and that neither the body of the dog nor of his master has been cast on the shore." "It is not astonishing with such a heavy sea," replied the sailor. "Besides, it's possible the currents have carried them farther down the coast." "Then it's your opinion that our friend has perished in the waves?" again asked the reporter. "That is my opinion." "My own opinion," said Gideon Spilett, "with due deference to your experience, Pencroft, is that in the double fact of the absolute disappearance of Cyrus and Top, living or dead, there is something unaccountable and unlikely." "I wish I could think like you, Mr. Spilett," replied Pencroft. "Unhappily, my mind is made up on this point." Having said this, the sailor returned to the chimneys. A good fire crackled on the hearth. Herbert had just thrown on an armful of dry wood, and the flame cast a bright light into the darkest parts of the passage. Pencroft immediately began to prepare the dinner. It appeared best to introduce something solid into the bill of fare, for all needed to get up their strength. The strings of couroucous were kept for the next day, but they plucked a couple of grouse, which were soon spitted on a stick and roasting before a blazing fire. At 7 in the evening, Neb had not returned. The prolonged absence of the negro made Pencroft very uneasy. It was to be feared that he had met with an accident on this unknown land, or that the unhappy fellow had been driven to some act of despair. But Herbert drew very different conclusions from this absence. According to him, Neb's delay was caused by some new circumstances which had induced him to prolong his search. Also, everything new must be to the advantage of Cyrus Harding. Why had Neb not returned unless hope still detained him? Perhaps he had found some mark, a footstep, a trace which had put him in the right path. Perhaps he was at this moment on a certain track. Perhaps even he was near his master. Thus the lad reasoned. Thus he spoke. His companions let him talk. The reporter alone approved with a gesture. But what Pencroft thought most probable was that Ned had pushed his researches on the shore farther than the day before, and that he had not as yet had time to return. Herbert, however, agitated by vague presentiments, several times manifested an intention to go to meet Neb, but Pencroft assured him that that would be a useless course, that in the darkness and deplorable weather he could not find any traces of Neb, and that it would be much better to wait. If Neb had not made his appearance by the next day, Pencroft would not hesitate to join him in his search. Gideon Spilett approved of the sailor's opinion that it was best not to divide, and Herbert was obliged to give up his project. But 2 large tears fell from his eyes. The reporter could not refrain from embracing the generous boy. Bad weather now set in. A furious gale from the southeast passed over the coast. The sea roared as it beat over the reef. Heavy rain was dashed by the storm into particles like dust. Ragged masses of vapor drove along the beach, on which the tormented shingles sounded as if poured out in cartloads, while the sand raised by the wind added, as it were, mineral dust to that which was liquid, and rendered the united attack insupportable. Between the river's mouth and the end of the cliff, eddies of wind whirled, and gusts from this maelstrom lashed the water which ran through the narrow valley. The smoke from the fireplace was also driven back through the opening, filling the passages and rendering them uninhabitable. Therefore, as the grouse were cooked, Pencroft let the fire die away, and only preserved a few embers buried under the ashes. At 8 o'clock, Neb had not appeared, but there was no doubt that the frightful weather alone hindered his return, and that he must have taken refuge in some cave to await the end of the storm, or at least the return of day. As to going to meet him, or attempting to find him, it was impossible. The game constituted the only dish at supper. The meat was excellent, and Pencroft and Herbert, whose long excursion had rendered them very hungry, devoured it with infinite satisfaction. Their meal concluded, each retired to the corner in which he had rested the preceding night, and Herbert was not long in going to sleep near the sailor, who had stretched himself beside the fireplace. Outside, as the night advanced, the tempest also increased in strength, until it was equal to that which had carried the prisoners from Richmond to this land of the Pacific. The tempests which are frequent during the seasons of the equinox, and which are so prolific in catastrophes, are above all terrible over this immense ocean, which opposes no obstacle to their fury. No description can give an idea of the terrific violence of the gale as it beat upon the unprotected coast. Happily, the pile of rocks which formed the chimneys was solid. It was composed of enormous blocks of granite, a few of which, insecurely balanced, seemed to tremble on their foundations, and Pencroft could feel rapid quiverings under his head as it rested on the rock. But he repeated to himself, and rightly, that there was nothing to fear, and that the retreat would not give way. However, he heard the noise of stones torn from the summit of the plateau by the wind falling down on the beach. A few even rolled onto the upper part of the chimneys, or flew off in fragments when they were projected perpendicularly. Twice the sailor rose and entrenched himself at the opening of the passage, so as to take a look in safety at the outside. But there was nothing to be feared from these showers, which were not considerable, and he returned to his couch before the fireplace, where the embers glowed beneath the ashes. Notwithstanding the fury of the hurricane, the uproar of the tempest, the thunder, and the tumult, Herbert slept profoundly. Sleep at last took possession of Pencroft, whom a seafaring life had habituated to anything. Gideon Spilett alone was kept awake by anxiety. He reproached himself with not having accompanied Neb. It was evident that he had not abandoned all hope. The presentiments which had troubled Herbert did not cease to agitate him also. His thoughts were concentrated on Neb. Why had Neb not returned? He tossed about on his sandy couch, scarcely giving a thought to the struggle of the elements. Now and then his eyes, heavy with fatigue, closed for an instant, but some sudden thought reopened them almost immediately. Meanwhile the night advanced, and it was perhaps 2 hours from morning when Pencroft, then sound asleep, was vigorously shaken. "What's the matter?" he cried, rousing himself and collecting his ideas with the promptitude usual to seamen. The reporter was leaning over him and saying, "Listen, Pencroft, listen!" The sailor strained his ears, but could hear no noise beyond those caused by the storm. "It is the wind," said he. "No," replied Gideon Spilett, listening again. "I thought I heard—" "What?" "The barking of a dog." "A dog?" cried Pencroft, springing up. "Yes, barking." "It's not possible," replied the sailor. And besides, how in the roaring of the storm? Stop, listen, said the reporter. Pencroft listened more attentively, and really thought he heard, during a lull, distant barking. Well, said the reporter, pressing the sailor's hand. Yes, yes, replied Pencroft. It is Top. It's Top, cried Herbert, who had just awoke, and all three rushed towards the opening of the chimneys. They had great difficulty in getting out. The wind drove them back, but at last they succeeded and could only remain standing by leaning against the rocks. They looked about, but could not speak. The darkness was intense. The sea, the sky, the land were all mingled into one black mass. Not a speck of light was visible. The reporter and his companions remained thus for a few minutes, overwhelmed by the wind, drenched by the rain, blinded by the sand. Then, in a pause of the tumult, they again heard the barking, which they found must be at some distance. It could only be Top. But was he alone or accompanied? He was most probably alone, for if Neb had been with him, he would have made his way more directly towards the chimneys. The sailor squeezed the reporter's hand, for he could not make himself heard in a way which signified, "Wait." Then he re-entered the passage. An instant after, he issued with a lighted faggot, which he threw into the darkness, whistling shrilly. It appeared as if this signal had been waited for. The barking immediately came nearer, and soon a dog bounded into the passage. Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett entered after him. An armful of dry wood was thrown on the embers. The passage was lighted up with a bright flame. "It is Top!" cried Herbert. It was indeed Top, a magnificent Anglo-Norman who, derived from those two races, crossed the swiftness of foot and the acuteness of smell which are the preeminent qualities of coursing dogs. It was the dog of the engineer, Cyrus Harding. But he was alone. Neither Neb nor his master accompanied him. How was it that his instinct had guided him straight to the chimneys, which he did not know? It appeared inexplicable, above all in the midst of this black night and in such a tempest. But what was still more inexplicable was that Top was neither tired nor exhausted, nor even soiled with mud or sand. Herbert had drawn him towards him, and was patting his head, the dog rubbing his neck against the lad's hands. "If the dog is found, the master will be found also," said the reporter. "God grant it," responded Herbert. "Let us set off. Top will guide us." Pencroft did not make any objection. He felt that Top's arrival contradicted his conjectures. "Come along, then," said he. Pencroft carefully covered the embers on the hearth. He placed a few pieces of wood among them so as to keep in the fire until their return. Then, preceded by the dog, who seemed to invite them by short barks to come with him, and followed by the reporter and the boy, he dashed out after having put up in his handkerchief the remains of the supper. The storm was then in all its violence, and perhaps at its height. Not a single ray of light from the moon pierced through the clouds. To follow a straight course was difficult. It was best to rely on Top's instinct. They did so. The reporter and Herbert walked behind the dog, and the sailor brought up the rear. It was impossible to exchange a word. The rain was not very heavy, but the wind was terrific. However, one circumstance favored the seaman and his two companions. The wind being southeast, consequently blew on their backs. The clouds of sand, which otherwise would have been insupportable from being received behind, did not, in consequence, impede their progress. In short, they sometimes went faster than they liked, and had some difficulty in keeping their feet. But hope gave them strength, for it was not at random that they made their way along the shore. They had no doubt that Neb had found his master, and that he had sent them the faithful dog. But was the engineer living, or had Neb only sent for his companions that they might render the last duties to the corpse of the unfortunate Harding? After having passed the precipice, Herbert, the reporter, and Pencroft prudently stepped aside to stop and take breath. The turn of the rocks sheltered them from the wind, and they could breathe after this walk, or rather run, of a quarter of an hour. They could now hear and reply to each other, and the lad having pronounced the name of Cyrus Harding, Top gave a few short barks, as much as to say that his master was saved. "Saved, isn't he?" repeated Herbert. "Saved, Top?" And the dog barked in reply. They once more set out. The tide began to rise, and urged by the wind, it threatened to be unusually high, as it was a spring tide. Great billows thundered against the reef with such violence that they probably passed entirely over the islet, then quite invisible. The mole no longer protected the coast, which was directly exposed to the attacks of the open sea. As soon as the sailor and his companions left the precipice, the wind struck them again with renewed fury. Though bent under the gale, they walked very quickly, following Top, who did not hesitate as to what direction to take. They ascended towards the north, having on their left an interminable extent of billows, which broke with a deafening noise, and on their right a dark country, the aspect of which it was impossible to guess. But they felt that it was comparatively flat, for the wind passed completely over them, without being driven back as it was when it came in contact with the cliff. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they reckoned that they had cleared about 5 miles. The clouds were slightly raised, and the wind, though less damp, was very sharp and cold. Insufficiently protected by their clothing, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett suffered cruelly, but not a complaint escaped their lips. They were determined to follow Top, wherever the intelligent animal wished to lead them. Towards 5 o'clock, day began to break. At the zenith, where the fog was less thick, gray shades bordered the clouds. Under an opaque belt, a luminous line clearly traced the horizon. The crests of the billows were tipped with a wild light, and the foam regained its whiteness. At the same time, on the left, the hilly parts of the coast could be seen, though very indistinctly. At 6 o'clock, day had broken. The clouds rapidly lifted. The seaman and his companions were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys. They were following a very flat shore bounded by a reef of rocks, whose heads scarcely emerged from the sea, for they were in deep water. On the left, the country appeared to be one vast extent of sandy downs, bristling with thistles. There was no cliff, and the shore offered no resistance to the ocean but a chain of irregular hillocks. Here and there grew 2 or 3 trees inclined towards the west, their branches projecting in that direction. Quite behind, in the southwest, extended the border of the forest. At this moment, Top became very excited. He ran forward, then returned, and seemed to entreat them to hasten their steps. The dog then left the beach, and guided by his wonderful instinct, without showing the least hesitation, went straight in among the downs. They followed him. The country appeared an absolute desert. Not a living creature was to be seen. The downs, the extent of which was large, were composed of hillocks and even of hills, very irregularly distributed. They resembled a Switzerland modeled in sand, and only an amazing instinct could have possibly recognized the way. 5 minutes after leaving the beach, the reporter and his 2 companions arrived at a sort of excavation, hollowed out at the back of a high mound. There Top stopped and gave a loud, clear bark. Spilett, Herbert, and Pencroft dashed into the cave. Neb was there, kneeling beside a body extended on a bed of grass. The body was that of the engineer, Cyrus Harding. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Neb did not move. Pencroft only uttered one word. "Living?" he cried. Neb did not reply. Spilett and the sailor turned pale. Herbert clasped his hands and remained motionless. The poor negro, absorbed in his grief, evidently had neither seen his companions nor heard the sailor speak. The reporter knelt down beside the motionless body and placed his ear to the engineer's chest, having first torn open his clothes. A minute, an age passed, during which he endeavored to catch the faintest throb of the heart. Neb had raised himself a little and gazed without seeing. Despair had completely changed his countenance. He could scarcely be recognized, exhausted with fatigue, broken with grief. He believed his master was dead. Gideon Spilett at last rose after a long and attentive examination. "He lives," said he. Pencroft knelt in his turn beside the engineer. He also heard a throbbing and even felt a slight breath on his cheek. Herbert, at a word from the reporter, ran out to look for water. He found, 100 feet off, a limpid stream which seemed to have been greatly increased by the rains, and which filtered through the sand, but nothing in which to put the water, not even a shell among the downs. The lad was obliged to content himself with dipping his handkerchief in the stream, and with it hastened back to the grotto. Happily, the wet handkerchief was enough for Gideon Spilett, who only wished to wet the engineer's lips. The cold water produced an almost immediate effect. His chest heaved, and he seemed to try to speak. "We will save him," exclaimed the reporter. At these words, hope revived in Neb's heart. He undressed his master to see if he was wounded, but not so much as a bruise was to be found, either on the head, body, or limbs, which was surprising, as he must have been dashed against the rocks. Even the hands were uninjured, and it was difficult to explain how the engineer showed no traces of the efforts which he must have made to get out of reach of the breakers. But the explanation would come later. When Cyrus was able to speak, he would say what had happened. For the present, the question was how to recall him to life, and it appeared likely that rubbing would bring this about, so they set to work with a sailor's jersey. The engineer, revived by this rude shampooing, moved his arms slightly and began to breathe more regularly. He was sinking from exhaustion, and certainly had not the reporter and his companions arrived, it would have been all over with Cyrus Harding. "You thought your master was dead, didn't you?" said the seaman to Neb. "Yes, quite dead," replied Neb. "And if Top had not found you and brought you here, I should have buried my master, and then have laid down on his grave to die." It had indeed been a narrow escape for Cyrus Harding. Neb then recounted what had happened. The day before, after having left the chimney at daybreak, he had ascended the coast in a northerly direction, and had reached that part of the shore which he had already visited. There, without any hope he acknowledged, Neb had searched the beach, among the rocks, on the sand, for the smallest trace to guide him. He examined particularly that part of the beach which was not covered by the high tide, for near the sea the water would have obliterated all marks. Neb did not expect to find his master living. It was for a corpse that he searched, a corpse which he wished to bury with his own hands. He sought long in vain. This desert coast appeared never to have been visited by a human creature. The shells, those which the sea had not reached and which might be met with by millions above high water mark, were untouched. Not a shell was broken. Neb then resolved to walk along the beach for some miles. It was possible that the waves had carried the body to quite a distant point. When a corpse floats a little distance from a low shore, it rarely happens that the tide does not throw it up sooner or later. This Neb knew, and he wished to see his master again for the last time. I went along the coast for another 2 miles, carefully examining the beach, both at high and low water, and I had despaired of finding anything, when yesterday, about 5 in the evening, I saw footprints on the sand. Footprints? Exclaimed Pencroft. Yes, replied Neb. Did the footprints begin at the water's edge? Asked the reporter. No, replied Neb. Only above high water mark. The others must have been washed out by the tide. Go on, Neb, said Spilett. I went half crazy when I saw these footprints. They were very clear and went towards the downs. I followed them for a quarter of a mile, running, but taking care not to destroy them. 5 minutes after, as it was getting dark, I heard the barking of a dog. It was Top, and Top brought me here, to my master. Neb ended his account by saying what had been his grief at finding the inanimate body in which he vainly sought for the least sign of life. Now that he had found him dead, he longed for him to be alive. All his efforts were useless. Nothing remained to be done but to render the last duties to the one whom he had loved so much. Neb then thought of his companions. They no doubt would wish to see the unfortunate man again. Top was there. Could he not rely on the sagacity of the faithful animal? Neb several times pronounced the name of the reporter, the one among his companions whom Top knew best. Then he pointed to the south, and the dog bounded off in the direction indicated to him. We have heard how, guided by an instinct which might be looked upon almost as supernatural, Top had found them. Neb's companions had listened with great attention to this account. It was unaccountable to them how Cyrus Harding, after the efforts which he must have made to escape from the waves by crossing the rocks, had not received even a scratch. And what could not be explained either was how the engineer had managed to get to this cave in the downs, more than a mile from the shore. "So, Neb," said the reporter, "it was not you who brought your master to this place?" "No, it was not I," replied the Negro. "It's very clear that the captain came here by himself," said Pencroft. "It's clear in reality," observed Spilett, "but it's not credible." The explanation of this fact could only be produced from the engineer's own lips, and they must wait for that till speech returned. Rubbing had re-established the circulation of the blood. Cyrus Harding moved his arm again, then his head, and a few incomprehensible words escaped him. Neb, who was bending over him, spoke, but the engineer did not appear to hear, and his eyes remained closed. Life was only exhibited in him by movement. His senses had not as yet been restored. Pencroft much regretted not having either fire or the means of procuring it, for he had, unfortunately, forgotten to bring the burnt linen, which would easily have ignited from the sparks produced by striking together two flints. As to the engineer's pockets, they were entirely empty, except that of his waistcoat, which contained his watch. It was necessary to carry Harding to the Chimneys, and that as soon as possible. This was the opinion of all. Meanwhile, the care which was lavished on the engineer brought him back to consciousness sooner than they could have expected. The water with which they wetted his lips revived him gradually. Pencroft also thought of mixing with the water some moisture from the titra's flesh which he had brought. Herbert ran to the beach and returned with 2 large bivalve shells. The sailor concocted something which he introduced between the lips of the engineer, who, eagerly drinking it, opened his eyes. Neb and the reporter were leaning over him. "My master! My master!" cried Neb. The engineer heard him. He recognized Neb and Spilett, then his other 2 companions, and his hand slightly pressed theirs. A few words again escaped him, which showed what thoughts were, even then, troubling his brain. This time he was understood. Undoubtedly they were the same words he had before attempted to utter. "Island or continent?" he murmured. "Bother the continent," cried Pencroft hastily. "There's time enough to see about that, Captain. We don't care for anything, provided you're living." The engineer nodded faintly, and then appeared to sleep. They respected his sleep, and the reporter began immediately to make arrangements for transporting Harding to a more comfortable place. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroft left the cave and directed their steps towards a high mound crowned with a few distorted trees. On the way, the sailor could not help repeating, "Island or continent? To think of that when one at one's last gasp. What a man!" Arrived at the summit of the mound, Pencroft and his 2 companions set to work, with no other tools than their hands, to despoil of its principal branches a rather sickly tree, a sort of marine fir. With these branches they made a litter on which, covered with grass and leaves, they could carry the engineer. This occupied them nearly 40 minutes, and it was 10 o'clock when they returned to Cyrus Harding, whom Spilett had not left. The engineer was just waking from the sleep, or rather from the drowsiness, in which they had found him. The color was returning to his cheeks, which till now had been as pale as death. He raised himself a little, looked around him, and appeared to ask where he was. "Can you listen to me without fatigue, Cyrus?" asked the reporter. "Yes," replied the engineer. "It's my opinion," said the sailor, "that Captain Harding will be able to listen to you still better if he will have some more grouse jelly. For we have grouse, Captain," added he, presenting him with a little of this jelly, to which he this time added some of the flesh. Cyrus Harding ate a little of the grouse, and the rest was divided among his companions, who found it but a meager breakfast, for they were suffering extremely from hunger. "Well," said the sailor, "there's plenty of food at the Chimneys, for you must know, Captain, that down there in the south we have a house, with rooms, beds, and fireplace, and in the pantry several dozen of birds, which our Herbert calls carucus. Your litter is ready, and as soon as you feel strong enough, we'll carry you home." "Thanks, my friend," replied the engineer. "Wait another hour or two, then we will set out. And now, speak, Spilett." The reporter then told him all that had occurred. He recounted all the events with which Cyrus was unacquainted. The last fall of the balloon, the landing on this unknown land, which appeared a desert, whatever it was, whether island or continent, the discovery of the Chimneys, the search for him, not forgetting, of course, Neb's devotion, the intelligence exhibited by the faithful Top, as well as many other matters. "But," asked Harding in a still feeble voice, "you did not then pick me up on the beach?" "No," replied the reporter. "And did you not bring me to this cave?" "No." "At what distance is this cave from the sea?" "About a mile," replied Pencroft. "And if you are astonished, Captain, we're not less surprised ourselves at seeing you in this place." "Indeed," said the engineer, who was recovering gradually and who took great interest in these details. "Indeed, it is very singular." "But," resumed the sailor, "can you tell us what happened after you were carried off by the sea?" Cyrus Harding considered. He knew very little. The wave had torn him from the balloon net. He sank at first several fathoms. On returning to the surface in the half-light, he felt a living creature struggling near him. It was Top, who had sprung to his help. He saw nothing of the balloon, which, lightened both of its weight and that of the dog, had darted away like an arrow. There he was, in the midst of the angry sea, at a distance which could not be less than half a mile from the shore. He attempted to struggle against the billows by swimming vigorously. Top held him up by his clothes, but a strong current seized him and drove him towards the north, and after half an hour of exertion he sank, dragging Top with him into the depths. From that moment to the moment in which he recovered to find himself in the arms of his friends, he remembered nothing. "However," remarked Pencroft, "you must have been thrown onto the beach, and you must have had strength to walk here, since Neb found your footmarks." "Yes, of course," replied the engineer thoughtfully. "And you found no traces of human beings on this coast?" "Not a trace," replied the reporter. "Besides, if by chance you had met with some deliverer there, just in the nick of time, why should he have abandoned you after having saved you from the waves?" "You're right, my dear Spilett. Tell me, Neb," added the engineer, turning to his servant, "it was not you... You can't have had a moment of unconsciousness, during which... No, that's absurd. Do any of the footsteps still remain?" asked Harding. "Yes, master," replied Neb. "Here at the entrance, at the back of the mound, in a place sheltered from the rain and wind. The storm has destroyed the others." "Pencroft," said Cyrus Harding, "will you take my shoe and see if it fits exactly to the footprint?" The sailor did as the engineer requested. While he and Herbert, guided by Neb, went to the place where the footprints were to be found, Cyrus remarked to the reporter, "It is a most extraordinary thing." "Perfectly inexplicable," replied Gordon Spilett. perfectly inexplicable," replied Gideon Spilett. "But do not dwell upon it just now, my dear Spilett. We'll talk about it by and by." A moment after, the others entered. There was no doubt about it. The engineer's shoe fitted exactly to the footmarks. It was therefore Cyrus Harding who had left them on the sand. "Come," said he. "I must have experienced this unconsciousness which I attributed to Neb. I must have walked like a somnambulist, without any knowledge of my steps, and Top must have guided me here after having dragged me from the waves. Come, Top, come, old dog." The magnificent animal bounded, barking, to his master, and caresses were lavished on him. It was agreed that there was no other way of accounting for the rescue of Cyrus Harding, and that Top deserved all the honor of the affair. Towards 12 o'clock, Pencroft having asked the engineer if they could now remove him, Harding, instead of replying, and by an effort which exhibited the most energetic will, got up. But he was obliged to lean on the sailor, or he would have fallen. "Well done!" cried Pencroft. "Bring the captain's litter." The litter was brought. The transverse branches had been covered with leaves and long grass. Harding was laid on it, and Pencroft, having taken his place at one end and Neb at the other, started towards the coast. There was a distance of 8 miles to be accomplished, but as they could not go fast, and it would perhaps be necessary to stop frequently, they reckoned that it would take at least 6 hours to reach the Chimneys. The wind was still strong, but fortunately it did not rain. Although lying down, the engineer, leaning on his elbow, observed the coast, particularly inland. He did not speak, but he gazed, and no doubt the appearance of the country, with its inequalities of ground, its forest, its various productions, were impressed on his mind. However, after traveling for 2 hours, fatigue overcame him, and he slept. At 5:30, the little band arrived at the precipice, and a short time after, at the Chimneys. They stopped, and the litter was placed on the sand. Cyrus Harding was sleeping profoundly and did not awake. Pencroft, to his extreme surprise, found that the terrible storm had quite altered the aspect of the place. Important changes had occurred. Great blocks of stone lay on the beach, which was also covered with a thick carpet of seaweed, algae, and wrack. Evidently the sea, passing over the islet, had been carried right up to the foot of the enormous curtain of granite. The soil in front of the cave had been torn away by the violence of the waves. A horrid presentiment flashed across Pencroft's mind. He rushed into the passage, but returned almost immediately, and stood motionless, staring at his companions. The fire was out. The drowned cinders were nothing but mud. The burnt linen, which was to have served as tinder, had disappeared. The sea had penetrated to the end of the passages, and everything was overthrown and destroyed in the interior of the Chimneys. End of Chapter 8. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.